Isaiah chapter 40, would you look at verse number 31? Isaiah 40, verse number 31. If you're on the church-wide email list, maybe you saw that and got the word that will be in Isaiah 40. And maybe you spent some time, a couple of you did. You mentioned it to me this morning or texted me that you've been reading Isaiah 40. And so we will be focused for the next several weeks, 3 or 4 weeks, as the Lord leads, on the familiar verse number 31. And in order for us to really appreciate verse number 31 of Isaiah 40, we must understand it in its context. We must understand kind of the who, what, where, when, why, and how of that very, very famous and inspirational and poetic verse. And so that's exactly what we're going to give ourselves to for the next several weeks. Of course, we have Sanctity of Human Life, a Right to Life Sunday coming up on a Sunday morning. So maybe that Sunday night I'll do this series. So just maybe a pause there from the sermon series. But I'd really like us to consider Isaiah 40:31 in its context and then carry it with us throughout 2021. One of the men in our church suggested that we consider this as a theme verse. And I thought that was a great thing to suggest, and I prayerfully considered it and felt like the Lord led us to do that. So churches sometimes have themes for the year. If we were to pick a theme, pick a verse that we could cling to all year long, I think it's appropriate for us to cling to Isaiah 40:31, but more than just cling to it in a cliche way, let's cling to it in 2021 with some depth, with a level of robust understanding of the context, of the situation in which it's given, of the background. And so that's why we'll take essentially, likely 4 weeks or 4 sermons dedicated to one verse. You say, Pastor Johnson, are you real? Yeah, I really think we can do that. And I think we'll benefit from it. Because, there is a problem in American Christianity, 21st century Christianity, with being familiar with beautiful and poetic verses, being familiar just on a surface level, and lifting it up out of its context and making applications that maybe aren't applications that should be authorized. And so I think it'll be helpful, it'll be expedient, it'll be beneficial to God's people if we break it down. This verse number 31, we'll break it down in 4 ways. And so let's see the verse on the screen if we could. Hopefully you've got your Bible open. You can see it on your lap or you can see it on the screen. You say, Pastor Johnson, how are you going to break this sermon series down into 4 weeks? Well, first of all, we're going to consider the Lord. That's today, the Lord, okay? And we'll get to that in just a minute. But they that wait upon the Lord. It's a beautiful verse, but if you don't understand the Lord, you don't understand who you're waiting on. You don't understand who's renewing your strength. And you don't understand who is able to then allow you to mount up with wings as eagles and run and not be weary and walk and not faint. So you must understand the Lord. So that's today. Not only the Lord, but then we're going to consider the wait. That'll be week 2, sermon 2. Wait, what does it really mean to wait on the Lord? I would suggest some of us have a misunderstanding or a skewed idea of what that means, and so we'll study that in some depth. So the Lord, the wait, then we'll consider the strength. The strength. And further, I would suggest that the entire chapter of Isaiah 40 is really dedicated to this idea of how to have renewed strength. Like 31 verses, and some of the surrounding verses, 39 and 41, these chapters, you understand, dedicated to how to have renewed strength. So we'll consider the Lord today, then the wait, then the strength, and then the 4th sermon, and Lord willing, the final sermon, will be the activity. There's a lot of activity mentioned in the latter part of verse number 31. The idea of mounting up with wings as eagles, and running and not being weary, and walking and not fainting. So it'll be the Lord, the wait, the strength, and the activity. All right, so this morning, this Lord's Day, let's consider the Lord. And all God's people said, because that's why we're here, to consider the Lord. You'll appreciate this promise and this poetic verse so much the more if you appreciate and understand who the Lord is. So let me give you a little bit of context. If I were to summarize the context, I would give descriptive terms such as these. The context is one of chaos and one of complaint. The people indeed, God's people, the chosen people, Israel, are in the midst of chaos, turmoil, and as a result, you find them complaining about their circumstance. You see it in verse number 27. That's why I had Brother Wasser start there. Isaiah says, "Why sayest thou, O Jacob, and speakest, O Israel? My way is hid from the Lord, and my judgment is passed over from my God." These people are complaining. They're complaining about the crisis that is all around them. They feel like, to sum up verse number 27 in a relatable way, have you ever complained this way? And here's what it means. You ever felt like God's answering everybody's prayer? God's ear is turned to everybody else except you? You know, you see other people, hear other testimonies, God's blessing them, God's providing for them, and God, I'm in the midst of chaos, turmoil, trial, and I pray, and it doesn't seem like you're doing anything about my situation. They're complaining. My way is hid from the Lord. My judgment, it's the idea of my cause, is passed over or disregarded from my God. They feel like God's asleep at the wheel. They feel like God's derelict in His duty. A lot like the psalmist often says, you know, the question, how long? How long am I going to face this and feel alone? Have you ever been there in your spiritual walk? That's where these people are. That's their complaint. They feel like God doesn't see them. They feel like God has disregarded them. And their complaint is based on the chaos. The chaos is that Sennacherib has invaded Israel. This Assyrian king has laid siege upon Jerusalem. And so you can understand that the Jews would be stressed, to say the least. To say the least, in a 21st century way, you can understand why their cortisol levels would be really high. They're stressed out. They have anxiety. They're in the midst of turmoil and chaos, and the Assyrian king has now taken over, and we don't know what's going to happen next. It's a time of uncertainty. Politically, practically. Anybody feel that way in 2021? Political uncertainty? I don't know what's going to happen January 6th, but there's a whole lot of hubbub about January 6th. I mean, we don't know. These people are in the midst of feeling all alone, feeling like it's uncertain times, God's asleep at the wheel, that's how they feel. They feel like they're free-falling into chaos and uncertainty, and they're even complaining about it. And what happens when people do that? What happens when we do that? Is we kind of make God like into I heard somebody say it this way, that sometimes we make God into a slot machine in the sky, you know, and some of their petition, some of their heart cry represents that in this circumstance, they feel like God is supposed to serve them as opposed to they're supposed to serve God. We get that reversed often, again in 21st century American Christianity. God, where are you? Why aren't you at my beck and call? The chaos, the circumstance, the turmoil, the trial. Why, God? I mean, as if the world revolves around us. That's like the spiritual disposition of their complaint. It's a bit entitled. It's a bit like God is their Santa Claus, who's, have I been naughty or nice? Well, I've been pretty nice, and so the trial that's been allowed in my life, it's almost as if they're saying, how dare you, God? What we so often do in the midst of unexpected, undesirable turmoil, trial circumstances, is people will get bitter at God because they've actually put themselves in the seat of the authority. We exalt ourselves, and then we diminish our God. That's what their complaint represents in verse number 27. Their cause has been disregarded by God, and it's as if God doesn't see them. And so how does the counselor, Isaiah, the prophet, how does he help them get this inaccurate vision of their situation? How does he help them see things the way they should see things? How does he clear it up? I mean, as a pastor, I have the privilege of counseling people in similar circumstances. And so how does a counselor help people sort all the chaos of their life out? One of the tactics that's thoroughly biblical that Isaiah uses here is he wants them to freshly see God. Because when you're overwhelmed by the chaos, by the turmoil, by the circumstance, all you see is the chaos, turmoil, and circumstance. You are struggling now to see your provider and your creator and the all-powerful God. All you see instead is not up and who God is and the character and the attributes of God. No, you see the attributes of your situation. What does the counselor Isaiah do? He reminds them who the Lord is. I would suggest that these verses really help us, and Isaiah is reminding his reader who their God is in the midst of crazy circumstances. How are you going to renew your strength? How are you going to mount up with wings as eagles? How are you going to do these wonderful activities? Well, it starts with understanding who the Lord is. Isaiah is basically saying, if you'll rediscover God's greatness, then you'll find hope. If you'll rediscover God's greatness, you'll find strength. And you will find the ability to move on. So I welcome not just you that are here. I referenced the live stream audience earlier in my prayer. So I welcome the live stream audience as well. I know there are several people right now, that are watching our live stream that are facing turmoil. And the reason they're watching live stream is because they can't be here with us in person. They want to be, but they're facing stuff. There's some that have a surgery that is right around the corner, and their doctor said it's best if you stay away from people as much as you can. You got surgery next week or the week after, whatever. And so they're joining us via live stream, and it'd be natural for their hearts to have a little bit of anxiety about the surgery that's right around the corner. It's a stressful thing. There's others that are watching live stream that are concerned about the situation with somebody that they love. And they're aiding that individual, and they're burdened themselves because so it's kind of a relational struggle or turmoil, trial. And so there's a diversity of individuals joining us via live stream, and yet there's a diversity when it comes to the calamity facing even the people that are sitting here. And you might find yourself overwhelmed, and maybe some in your flesh facing whatever the turmoil is, you find yourself with a little bit of complaint. You find yourself wondering, where is God in my situation? Why does it feel like He has disregarded me? And you say, no, Pastor, I'm strong in my faith, and I'm not feeling that now. And if that's true, I commend you for that. However, we don't know what 2021 is going to hold. We don't know what the calamity or the turmoil, none of us anticipated what most of us faced in 2020. We don't know what 2021 has. And so these principles will be very, very helpful. What he is saying again, Isaiah is saying in verse number 31 essentially, is that if you'll rediscover God's greatness, you'll find that hope and that strength and that ability to go on. And not only that, it's not just about the attribute of God's greatness. Today the focus is on the Lord. If you'll rediscover not just God's greatness, if you'll just rediscover God. Like, love Him not just for what He can do for you, but love Him just for who He is. It's then that you find the hope and the strength and the ability to go on. And so that's what we're going to spend the remainder of our time doing. Considering, notice verse number 31, that wait upon the Lord. That's what we're focused on. And understanding the context of the chapter, How does he strengthen the faith of the reader? Over and over and over again in the 31 verses, he tells you who the Lord is. And I went through it myself. I went through it a couple times now, and I came up with 12 attributes of who God is. He's the one that if we wait on, our strength will be renewed. So who is this one that we have trouble seeing in the midst of calamity? Who is the one that we can't see and therefore we complain about our circumstance? And this is not just my idea that you would see the Lord, not just my idea that I would point out these 12 attributes of who God is so that we together this morning hopefully see Him more clearly. Not just my idea. Matter of fact, it's Isaiah's idea. If you go through the 31 verses, you'll find, I think, 3 times the little phrase, behold your God. In other words, by the way, you find it at the end of verse number 9, behold your God. If you're in the habit of marking in your Bible, you might underline that. Verse number 10, behold the Lord God. You continue through the text, you find it in verse number 26. Lift up your eyes on high and behold who hath created these things. In other words, in the midst of uncertain times and calamity, in the midst of complaint, Isaiah says, hey, I want you to see God. Behold your Lord. He wants you to see God afresh. He wants you to see God clearly. And so what does he do? He dedicates this portion of his writings to defining attributes of God's character. This is, I would say, not a comprehensive list. The Bible itself, by the way, is not a comprehensive indication of all that God is. It's a selective list. God reveals aspects of who he is, and we rejoice in what he reveals about himself. But if you read through these 31 verses with the intent to see God, you'll see some amazing attributes concerning who is the one that can lift me out of the miry clay. So homework, your own study, whatever, I would suggest that you take time to go through and see the attributes of God. I'm going to give you my 12, and I'll go through it quickly. Here's the first one. You see it at the end of verse number 2, and that is that the Lord is holy. Who is the Lord? First of all, the Lord is holy. You'll notice at the end of verse number 2, God's attention when it comes to their sins. Ladies and gentlemen, in a culture, a Christian climate where the emphasis is constantly on the love of God, and indeed God is love, and it is one of his attributes, we cannot so exalt the attribute of the love of God to the exclusion of the holiness of God. God is set apart from sin, and God's wrath is against sin, and there does come a day of judgment in relationship to sin. God is holy, and we are called in Peter's writings to be holy, just as our God is holy. Who is the Lord? Well, the Lord is holy, Isaiah is reminding the reader. Not only that, you see in verse number 4 that the Lord is willful. That the Lord is willful. I think it's beautifully written to describe the willful nature of our God. Notice verse number 4, every valley shall be exalted and every mountain. Okay, so you're getting that, right? Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. You're seeing the contrasting concepts here. And the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. God can do anything he wants. He is willful. Not only this, but God is glorious, a third attribute of God. Verse number 5, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. The Lord is glorious. His glory is revealed in his willfulness. Not only this, but continue through verse number 5, that all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. Verse number 6, the voice said, cry, and he said, what shall I cry? And listen to this. All flesh, by the way, you and I are flesh. All flesh is grass, and all the goodliness thereof is as the flower of the field. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, because the Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon it. Surely the people is grass. A fourth attribute of who the Lord is the Lord is superior. We are but grass. He is superior to us. That's the idea behind verses 6 and 7. Not only that, but the Lord is eternal. That's the fifth idea. The Lord is eternal in verse number 8. Notice the grass withereth. Now, we know this verse because it's quoted in the New Testament. The Apostle Peter and others, I think the Apostle Paul, quote this verse, familiar verse from Isaiah 40, verse number 8. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. We love that verse, and we're always highlighting that the word is eternal, but don't overlook the fact that we're the grass that withers. The contrast that we are to understand is that in our flesh, we are not as strong as we think. We are not as pretty as we think. You know, the flower is pretty, but the flower and the beauty of the flower, it fades. And what is further to be gleaned from verse number 8, not only that the Lord is eternal, but that the word of the Lord is eternal. What's really neat is that much of God's personal character is not only revealed in His Word, but is included in His Word. Like His Word is an extension of His character. He is eternal, and His Word is eternal. So let's review. If you're a note taker, I've said the Lord is holy. I've said the Lord is willful. I've said the Lord is glorious. I've said the Lord is superior. And the fifth idea, the Lord is eternal. Not only that, but verse number 10 tells us that the Lord is strong. The Lord is strong. Behold, the Lord God will come with strong hand, and His arm shall rule for Him. And all this is, again, is perspective. This is what the counselor does. You come to him and you say, I'm overwhelmed by the chaos in life. And he says, let's realign the perspective. The God that created you, which, by the way, he talks about the fact that He is creator later in the chapter. The God who created you, that's allowed this circumstance in your life, He's holy, He's willful, He's glorious, He's superior, He's eternal, and He's strong. Not only is He these things, but the seventh idea, He's tender. He's tender. Some of us, if you had a dad who was strong, you find confidence in the strength of your father. I mean, he's strong, and if someone were to come in the night into your home, you think, my dad is strong. He can defend us, and you take some comfort as a boy, as a child, maybe falling asleep, thinking, if something were to happen, my father is strong. But you know, you might also value a father who is tender. In those times maybe where you're weak, He's tender to meet your need as a father. And verse number 11 gives us this, verse number 11 gives us this tender nature of God. Verse number 11, that He feeds His flock like a shepherd. Tenderness. He shall gather the lambs with His arm and carry them in His bosom, and shall gently lead those that are with young. He's tender. Not only these attributes of God, but the eighth idea is that the Lord is big. The Lord is big. You say, Pastor Johnson, that's a pretty basic word. Some of you think Pastor Johnson has a pretty good vocabulary, and you're disappointed with the idea that the Lord is big. Well, let me just suggest to you that the vocabulary that we should be impressed with is in verse number 12. It is amazingly beautiful how the greatness or the bigness of God is described. Verse number 12, who hath measured the waters in the hollow of His hand, and meted out heaven with the span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales, and the hills in a balance. So these are rhetorical questions. You understand the purpose of a rhetorical question is to provoke you to thought. And it is absolutely a beautiful description here. The idea of measuring the waters in the hollow of His hand. I mean, that's a big hand. My family is kind of a sports family. We enjoy basketball and football and these kinds of things. And my father-in-law, who's in heaven now, 6'2", and if you're a sports person, you maybe covet height, okay? And 6'2" is reasonable height. And my father-in-law back in high school could dunk, but just a volleyball. See, the thing is, in volleyball, you don't have a basketball rim, so that never comes into play. The reason he couldn't dunk a basketball, even though he had some height, he didn't have the hands to grip it. Okay? It's a problem. Some people like football. They say one of the reasons that Brett Favre was such an amazing quarterback, I'm not saying he's the best ever, but he did play for the Minnesota Vikings for a minute, and I'm from Minnesota, and I didn't like him when he was playing against the Vikings, but I've learned to like him because he's a gun. I know he had a lot of interceptions, but he had a lot of touchdowns too. He's a gunslinger, a lot of fun to watch, right? Brett Favre. So listen to this. Big old hands. I mean, wrap around that football, and if you're familiar with football, you understand the importance of holding the ball with the laces. And, I mean, some of these NFL quarterbacks can throw a football, like, not as accurately as they want to, but 65, 70 yards. And a lot of it has to do with the size of their hand. The biggest hand in the room right here. Hopefully it's not one of the ladies. But whoever has it, whoever has the biggest hand in the house, imagine the hand of God. He measured the waters in the So the waters, I was just at the Atlantic Ocean, getting to see my family over there at South Carolina. It's pretty awesome. You look out at this Gulf water, it's pretty incredible. And by the way, I say awesome in this sentence deliberately. It's awesome. Can you imagine a hand so big that he could measure the waters in the hollow of his hand? In other words, the Lord is big, okay? And you continue through these pictures here, the idea of meted out heaven with a span. They say that the span is the distance from your thumb to your pinky finger. I mean, the whole point is that the Lord is big. That's what verse 12 is trying to get you to understand. Not only that aspect, but the Lord is all-knowing. That's what 13 and 14 tell us. The Lord is all-knowing. Look at this. Who hath directed the Spirit of the Lord, or being his counselor, hath taught him? The Lord doesn't need anybody to counsel him, doesn't need anybody to teach him. With whom took he counsel, verse 14, and whom instructed him, and taught him in the path of judgment, and taught him knowledge, and showed to him the way of understanding. The point is, again, with these rhetorical questions, the Lord doesn't need anybody to teach him anything. He is the wonderful counselor of Isaiah 9:6. He's all-knowing. All right, the 10th idea is this, and that is that the Lord is king. The Lord is king. Behold, the nations are as a drop of the bucket. And there's so much here in relationship to kings, and later in the text, verse 23, the idea of princes and judges, and all of these civil authority figures. And what Isaiah wants you to be reminded of is that the Lord is superior to all of them. He is the King of kings. Notice again, verse 15. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. We're so impressed with geographical locations and the power of the civil authority of this kingdom or of this nation. And Isaiah's helping the reader put it all in perspective to remind them that their creator God, he's actually the king. And these nations are as a drop of the bucket. You imagine a bucket? Just a little bit of water? And sometimes we do fret over the politics of our day. And yet, compared to who God is, it's silly to fret over those things. So the Lord is king. The 11th idea is that the Lord is incomparable. You cannot compare the Lord. He is incomparable. Notice this idea in verse number 18. To whom then will they liken God? Or what likeness will ye compare unto him? You see the same idea in verse number 25. If you skip down the verses there, verse 25, to whom then will ye liken me, or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? In other words, he's incomparable. Not only this idea, but the 12th and final attribute that I want to highlight is that the Lord, now I know you'll think this is just so profound, right? The Lord is God. And that's really what 19 through 25 are trying to tell us. That the Lord is God. And again, it's so beautiful how we're reminded of that. It's such a simple thing to say. And yet so often people either exalt themselves as God or they craft some kind of idol. Notice he addresses idolatry in verse number 19, the idea of a graven image, and some people will make them with gold and cast it with silver chains. So, but in verse number 20, maybe you don't have the money to come up with an idol that's gold and silver. So verse number 20, you're in an economically depressed situation. All you got is to create a wooden idol. That's financially where you are. You don't have the oblation, You're impoverished, so you can create an idol made of wood. That's the idea of a tree in verse number 20. And verse number 21, have ye not known? Have ye not heard? Hath it not been told you from the beginning? Have ye not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he that sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers, that stretcheth out the heavens as a curtain, and spreadeth them out as a tent to dwell in. The point is God. The point is that the Lord is God. And people try to worship all kinds of nonsense. And again, the counselor here is just giving us the proper perspective. He is saying, behold your Lord. Verse 26, he's saying, lift up your eyes on high. And this Lord that is God, as our God, he is our creator and our sustainer. And what 28 does, verse number 28, what it does is it summarizes, I think, a lot of what we just covered, and it answers their complaint in verse number 27. Verse 28 says, hast thou not known, hast thou not heard, that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, he fainteth not, neither is weary. There is no searching of his understanding. He giveth power to the faint. And by the way, they're faint in the midst of their calamity. They want renewed strength. And so, again, he's giving them perspective, saying that God is the one, the Lord is the one who gives them power. And to them that have no might, he increases strength. And even those that societally we think are strong, the youths, the ones that have life and vitality, they shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fail. Again, it's just a minimization of the strength of mankind that we so often trust in and that we're so often impressed with. It's helping us put our power and our strength in a proper perspective. That's the point, is to remind us of his power and his strength. That the Lord is holy is the first one. That the Lord is willful, to remind us that the Lord is glorious, that the Lord is superior, that the Lord is eternal, that the Lord is strong, and that he is tender, and that he is big, and that he is all-knowing, and that he is king, and that he is incomparable, and that the Lord is God. And they that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint. And the key to all that activity is knowing the Lord. Would you bow with me, please, for prayer?